Charity galas in Manhattan always smell like expensive perfume, vintage champagne, and tax evasion. I stood near the edge of the grand ballroom at the Plaza Hotel, holding a glass of sparkling water I had no intention of drinking. Across the room, my husband, Richard Sterling, was performing his favorite role, the charming, devoted alpha. He had his hand resting casually on the waist of his assistant Preston, a beta whose ambition vastly outweighed his actual competence. They thought they were being discreet. They weren't. I watched them with the mild, detached interest of someone observing a poorly written off-Broadway play. 10 years ago, the sight might have broken my heart. Tonight, it just made me tired. Everything made me tired these days. My plan for the evening was brilliantly simple. First, secure enough photographic evidence of Richard's infidelity to ensure my lawyer could absolutely butcher him in the divorce settlement. Second, seduce Arthur Thorne, the flashy, arrogant CEO of Thorne Industries and Richard's biggest rival. Third, extract enough insider financial leverage during our pillow talk to guarantee I'd walk away with a minimum of $50 million, and finally, retire to a tropical island and sleep for the next 3 decades. It was a flawless, efficient strategy, sassy not sloppy. The opportunity presented itself around midnight. I slipped away from the suffocating crowd and made my way to the darkened VIP lounges on the 2nd floor. The corridors were quiet, the air thick with the lingering pheromones of the elite. I stepped into a dimly lit suite, expecting to find Arthur holding court. Instead, the room was empty, save for a heavy silver Rolex discarded carelessly on the velvet sofa. I took off my gloves. That's my thing. By the way, psychometry. I can touch objects and read their history, emotions, and intentions bleeding through my fingertips like ink through wet paper. I picked up the watch. The psychic feedback hit me instantly. Metal holds memory like a bruise, and this watch was practically radiating. I felt an overwhelming wave of cold, calculated ambition, a hunger for absolute control, layered with a sharp, predatory intellect that frankly made Richard look like a toddler playing with building blocks. Arthur Thorne, I thought, impressed despite myself. The rumors are true. He's much more dangerous than he looks. Before I could set the watch down, the suite door clicked shut. The room was plunged into almost complete darkness. I smelled him before I saw him, winter pine ozone. In the dark, heavy scent of an alpha who didn't just command a room, but owned the oxygen in it. I didn't ask for his name. I just let the dark do its work, operating on the absolute certainty of my psychic reading. The encounter was intense, consuming, and aggressively commanding. It was the exact opposite of the cold, mechanical routine of my marriage. For a few hours, in the dark of a Manhattan hotel room, I wasn't the invisible Omega spouse. I was the center of gravity. When I woke up the next morning, the heavy drapes were slightly parted, letting a sliver of October sunlight slice across the king-sized bed. My entire body ached in a way that aggressively demanded a nap. I stretched, yawning, and turned my head to look at the man sleeping beside me. I was ready to deliver a perfectly rehearsed line about Arthur Thorne's stock options. The words died in my throat. The man lying next to me, his dark hair messy against the white silk pillowcase, was not Arthur Thorne. Arthur was blonde, flashy, and fundamentally average. This man possessed a jawline that looked like it had been carved from marble, and a presence that, even in sleep, felt terrifyingly heavy. I knew that face. Anyone on Wall Street knew that face. It was Alexander Thorne, Arthur's older twin brother, the apex alpha, the phantom mastermind behind Thorne Industries, a man who famously crushed entire corporations before his morning coffee and avoided public appearances like the plague. I sat up, the silk sheets pooling at my waist. I stared at him, then at the Rolex on the nightstand. The ambition I had felt last night wasn't the petty grasping of a rival CEO. It was the sheer, terrifying gravity of an apex predator. Every survival instinct I possessed screamed at me to panic. Sleeping with my husband's rival was a strategic business move. Sleeping with Alexander Thorne was like accidentally petting a sleeping dragon because you thought it was a large lizard. The political and social fallout of this mistake would require months of legal maneuvering, public relations control, and endless, exhausting conversations. I took a deep breath. I evaluated the massive, impending crisis. And then, I realized I was simply too lazy to deal with it. I slipped out of bed, gathered my clothes with practiced efficiency, and dressed in silence. Before leaving, I walked into the en-suite bathroom. I found a yellow sticky note in my coat pocket. I always carried them for impromptu design sketches, and uncapped a pen. If I was going to disappear, I was going to do it on my own terms. I leaned over the marble sink and wrote, 3 stars. Excellent stamina and impressive execution, but severely lacking the delicate nuance of a mid-afternoon nap. 10 out of 10 would not recommend to anyone with a busy sleep schedule. I peeled the note off the pad, walked back into the bedroom, and stuck it directly onto his phone screen on the nightstand. I didn't stay to see Alexander Thorne wake up. I didn't know it then, but according to his lawyer, who would recount the story to me months later with a mixture of horror and awe, Alexander didn't roar. He didn't tear the room apart. He woke up, read the note, and laughed out loud, a genuine sound that echoed in the empty suite. Then, he picked up the phone, dialed his assistant, and gave a single order, find him. But as I walked out of the Plaza Hotel and into the crisp Manhattan morning, hailing a cab to go back to Greenwich, all I cared about was the fact that I had a divorce to finalize, and desperately needed a cup of coffee. The law offices of Sterling and Hayes on Wall Street were designed to intimidate. They were heavy on mahogany, low on natural light, and infused with a specific, suffocating scent of aggressive alpha posturing. I sat in a leather chair that was too large for me, staring at the glossy surface of the conference table. Across from me sat Richard. Next to him was Preston, trying very hard to look like an essential part of the legal proceedings rather than what he actually was, a glorified secretary who had mistaken proximity for power. The terms are incredibly generous, Silas, Richard said, sliding a thick manila envelope across the table. His voice was smooth, carrying that practiced, artificial warmth he usually reserved for press conferences. The Greenwich house is yours, plus a lump sum of $2 million. I just want this to be efficient. I didn't touch the envelope. I didn't need to use psychometry to read the situation. 10 years of marriage was enough. $2 million for a decade of erasing my own existence to polish his. It was an insult disguised as a settlement. Efficient, I repeated, letting the word roll around in my mouth. I leaned back, crossing my legs. Preston, your tie is crooked, and it's synthetic silk. If you're going to sleep your way to the top, at least demand a better wardrobe budget. Preston flushed a deep, ugly red. Listen here. I don't listen to the help. I cut him off smoothly, not raising my voice. I looked back at Richard. $2 million, Richard, really? I know you've been funneling company funds into that Cayman offshore account for the last 18 months to hide it from the marital assets. I also know the passcode is your mother's maiden name followed by the year you peaked in college. Richard's confident mask cracked. The silence in the room suddenly felt very heavy, very real. How do you? Richard started, his jaw tightening. I'm an architect, Richard, I said, suppressing a yawn. I look at blueprints all day. It's not hard to see when a structure is missing a load-bearing wall, or when a financial statement is missing a few zeros. I picked up the pen resting on the table, turning it idly in my fingers. I was going to ask for $20 million. But honestly, arguing with you is exhausting, and I have a very important date with my duvet. I uncapped the pen. I was genuinely tired. The psychic burnout from 10 years of absorbing his coldness had left me depleted. Taking the $2 million and leaving him to his own eventual ruin seemed like the path of least resistance. The salted fish lifestyle was calling my name. The pen hovered a fraction of an inch above the signature line. Then, the heavy oak doors of the conference room didn't just open. They were pushed wide by 2 men in dark suits who stepped aside immediately. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Alexander Thorne walked in. He looked exactly as he had in the hotel room, but amplified. Dressed in a bespoke charcoal suit that screamed old money and absolute authority, he moved with the predatory, unhurried grace of a man who owned the building, the street, and possibly the oxygen we were all breathing. Behind him trailed a man clutching a leather briefcase, looking simultaneously terrified and highly competent. This, I would soon learn, was Harrison Clark, Alexander's long-suffering personal attorney. Richard stood up immediately, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Alexander, what is the meaning of this? This is a private mediation. Alexander didn't look at Richard. He didn't even acknowledge Preston, whose mouth was slightly open. His dark, slate-gray eyes locked directly onto me. The intensity of that stare made my pulse do something entirely unauthorized. He walked slowly around the massive table until he was standing right beside my chair. Without breaking eye contact with me, Alexander reached into the breast pocket of his suit jacket. He pulled out a small, rectangular object and dropped it gently onto the center of the mahogany table. It was my yellow sticky note. It had been carefully, perfectly laminated. A 3-star review, Alexander said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate in my chest. I found the critique illuminating. though I believe the methodology was flawed. Richard stared at the note, then at Alexander, then at me. His brain was visibly struggling to process the data. Silas, do you know Alexander Thorne? Unfortunately, I sighed, resting my chin on my hand. I looked up at Alexander, refusing to be intimidated by the sheer wall of alpha presence he was projecting. I gave you constructive feedback, Mr. Thorne. Most businesses send a thank you email, not a home invasion. Alexander's lips twitched. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was close. He turned to his lawyer, Harrison. Harrison stepped forward, slapped a significantly thicker folder down on top of Richard's pathetic settlement offer, and adjusted his glasses. Gentlemen, Harrison said, his tone perfectly flat, my client, Mr. Thorne, has reviewed the proposed settlement. We find it entirely unacceptable. Mr. Vance will not be signing this document. Excuse me, Richard finally found his voice, a mix of outrage and genuine panic. This is a private marital matter, Thorne. You can't just barge in here. Alexander leaned forward, resting both hands flat on the table, invading Richard's space entirely. The alpha dominance rolling off him was suffocating. Richard, Alexander said softly, and the quietness of his voice was far more terrifying than a shout. You seem to be operating under a misunderstanding. You are trying to put a price tag on something you do not own. He straightened up, his gaze shifting back to me. What is mine? Alexander stated clearly, leaving no room for negotiation. Does not get undervalued by the likes of you. I stared at Alexander. Every instinct told me this man was complicated, demanding, and exactly the kind of high-maintenance problem I had spent 10 years trying to avoid. I am not yours, I pointed out tiredly, and you are severely interrupting my schedule. I was supposed to be asleep 20 minutes ago. Alexander looked down at me, the predatory gleam in his eyes softening into something that looked dangerously like amusement. I know, he said softly. Come with me, Silas. I have a much better bed. Alexander Thorne's penthouse, occupying the top 3 floors of a glass and steel monolith overlooking Central Park, did not feel like a home. It felt like a perfectly tailored, $50 million threat. The aesthetic was aggressively minimalist dark slate, brushed steel, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of Manhattan, effectively reducing the city's millions of inhabitants to microscopic, irrelevant specks. As an architect, I could appreciate the structural brilliance of the space. As a human being who just wanted a nap, I found the lack of throw pillows deeply offensive. I stood in the center of the massive living room, running my fingertips over the edge of a black marble kitchen island. My psychometry flared immediately. Usually, homes hold warmth, stress, or the chaotic noise of daily life. This marble held absolutely nothing but cold, clinical control. It was like touching a perfectly executed hostile takeover. The view usually commands more attention, Alexander said. I turned. He had taken off his suit jacket, rolling up the sleeves of his crisp white shirt to reveal forearms that were undeniably, distractingly well proportioned. He was pouring 2 glasses of amber liquid at a nearby crystal decanter. The view is fine, I said, leaning against the cold marble. But the acoustic dampening in this room is incredible. You could scream in here and nobody on the lower floors would hear a thing. Which is either a brilliant design choice or a red flag for a serial killer. I haven't decided yet. Alexander paused, the crystal stopper hovering over the decanter. He looked at me, and that dangerous, amused gleam was back in his slate gray eyes. He walked over it, handing me a heavy crystal glass. I brought you here for a business proposition, Silas, he said, his voice a low, resonant hum that vibrated pleasantly in the quiet room. Arthur is making a move. He's trying to leverage the board to secure the CEO position permanently. My public image as a reclusive, unbonded alpha is being used as a liability. They want stability. They want a family man. I took a slow sip of the scotch. It tasted like oak and old money. Fascinating corporate drama, I said, setting the glass down. But I fail to see how your brother's superiority complex is my problem. My schedule is currently booked solid with doing absolutely nothing. You are going to act as my legal mate, Alexander stated. Not a question, a command, a quiet bonding. It neutralizes Arthur's argument instantly. In exchange, I will personally dismantle Richard Sterling. I will turn his firm into ash. And I will make sure his ambitious little assistant is blacklisted from every corporate entity in North America. I stared at him. He was standing close enough that the sheer weight of his alpha pheromones, winter pine in absolute dominance, was trying to force my nervous system into submission. I actively ignored it. Alexander, I said gently, like I was speaking to a slightly slow child. I am a psychometrist with a decade of Richard's financial records memorized. I can bankrupt him myself. It will take me exactly 3 months, one forensic audit, and a phone call to the SEC. Why would I volunteer for a fake marriage with you? That sounds like administrative work, and frankly, I am entirely too lazy for revenge plots that require wearing a suit. For a split second, Alexander looked genuinely surprised. Then, he stepped even closer, invading my personal space entirely. He braced his hands on the marble counter on either side of my hips, trapping me in without actually touching me. Because Silas, Alexander murmured, his voice dropping an octave. If you do it your way, you have to do the work. You have to make the calls. You have to talk to lawyers. I narrowed my eyes. He was hitting dangerously close to my core vulnerability. If you do it my way, he continued smoothly, you don't lift a finger. You stay in this penthouse. You sleep until noon. You buy whatever you want with a black card that has no limit. You exist, comfortably and undisturbed, while I burn your ex-husband's life to the ground on your behalf. The silence in the penthouse stretched. My salted fish ideology was currently waving a massive white flag in my brain. Absolute luxury, zero effort, and outsourcing my revenge to an apex predator. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. I'm listening, I said neutrally. Alexander smirked. He stepped back and gestured toward the heavy oak doors of his private study. Harrison. The doors opened, and Harrison Clark emerged, clutching a leather binder to his chest like a shield. He looked like a man who hadn't slept since 2015. He approached the kitchen island, laying a stack of paper exactly 3 inches thick onto the marble. Mr. Vance, Harrison said, his voice tight. This is the non-disclosure agreement, the prenuptial parameters, and the behavioral clauses for public appearances. It is comprehensive. I need you to review. I placed my hand flat on top of the stack. The psychometry hit me like a physical blow. 3 days of Harrison's frantic anxiety, 6 pots of stale coffee, and the terrifying fear of making a typo that would upset Alexander. I withdrew my hand, immediately exhausted. Harrison, I said, my voice dripping with aristocratic boredom. Your tie is a tragic shade of mustard that makes you look jaundiced. And I am absolutely not reading 100 pages of legal trauma you wrote at 3 in the morning. Harrison blinked, adjusting his glasses. Sir, the legal protections. I don't care, I interrupted, picking up the massive stack of paper. Without breaking eye contact with Harrison, I dropped the entire binder into the brushed steel recycling bin beside the island. It made a highly satisfying heavy thud. Harrison looked like he was about to have a medical emergency. He looked at Alexander. Boss, he can't just summarize it in 3 lines. I told Alexander, ignoring the lawyer completely. 1. I pretend to tolerate you in public. 2. You professionally assassinate my ex-husband. 3. You fund my early retirement. Anything more than that, and I'm walking out that door to find a reasonably priced motel. Harrison opened his mouth to protest the destruction of corporate law. Alexander raised a single hand. Harrison snapped his mouth shut instantly. Alexander reached into his shirt pocket, pulling out a sleek, obsidian fountain pen. He picked up a single piece of heavy, monogrammed stationery from a nearby tray. With sharp strokes, he wrote exactly 3 sentences. He slid the paper and the pen across the marble toward me. 1. Silas Vance acts as my bonded mate. 2. I dismantle Richard Sterling. 3. Silas Vance does whatever he wants. I picked up the pen. The weight of it was perfect. I looked at Alexander Thorne, the most dangerous man in New York, who was currently watching me with an expression that looked far too much like fascination. I signed my name at the bottom in a lazy, sweeping scrawl. Excellent, I yawned, capping the pen. Now, if you'll excuse me, I've had a very stressful morning dealing with your brother and your lawyer. Which way is the bedroom? I need a nap. The Hamptons in late summer is less a geographical location and more a competitive sport for the obscenely wealthy. It is a place where people wear linen aggressively and sip champagne while silently calculating the net worth of everyone in a 50-foot radius. I was currently standing on the sprawling lawn of a waterfront estate, fulfilling Clause 1 of my spectacularly brief contract with Alexander Thorne, public appearances. The news of my sudden, legally binding alliance with the apex alpha of New York had hit the elite social circuits like a localized earthquake. Consequently, I was the undisputed center of attention. Every socialite CEO and trust fund heir was watching me with a mixture of terror and rabid curiosity. I, however, was only focused on finding a place to sit down. My social battery had depleted approximately 45 minutes ago. Well, if it isn't the opportunist of the hour. I didn't need to turn around. The voice, nasal and dripping with artificial confidence, belonged entirely to Preston. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my martini before turning. Preston was standing there, flanked by Arthur Thorne. Arthur looked like he had stepped out of a catalog for yacht owners who get seasick. Preston, meanwhile, was wearing a white linen suit that was a tragedy of tailoring. "Preston," I said smoothly, my tone conversational. "Arthur, I see you two have formed a support group for the professionally inadequate." Arthur's jaw tightened. "Careful, Silas. My brother might have bought your debt, but you're still just a discarded Omega trying to stay relevant. Everyone here knows you're just using Alexander to get back at Richard." Preston nodded, playing his favorite role of the victimized protagonist. He touched his chest, drawing attention to a heavy gold necklace. "It's actually sad, Silas. Clinging to another man because you couldn't keep your own. Richard is finally happy. You should just let us be." I looked at Preston. Really looked at him. "Preston," I sighed, the absolute boredom in my voice acting as a physical weight. Playing the fragile victim requires a certain level of aesthetic grace that you simply do not possess. For instance, that Cartier necklace you are so desperately trying to showcase. It's a mid-tier replica. The gold plating is too yellow, and the clasp is currently turning the back of your neck a very unfortunate shade of green. Preston's hand flew to his neck, his face flushing a violent patchy red. "Furthermore," I continued, not raising my voice, ensuring the surrounding crowd had to lean in to hear the execution. "That linen suit is an off-the-rack blend that wrinkles if you breathe too hard. If you are going to sleep with a married man for social climbing purposes, at least demand a better wardrobe budget. You look like a walking PR crisis." Someone in the crowd let out an audible gasp. Arthur took a step back, instinctively distancing himself from the collateral damage. I didn't wait for a response. I turned and walked away, leaving Preston sputtering in the wreckage of his own public humiliation. Sassy, not sloppy. I navigated through the suffocating crowd and slipped through a set of French doors, finding a secluded, wraparound balcony that overlooked the dark, churning waters of the Atlantic. The quiet out here was immediate. I leaned against the heavy stone balustrade, setting my martini glass down. I rested my forehead against the cool marble. I was so incredibly tired. Without meaning to, I let my psychometry slip. I didn't touch an object to read someone else. I just let the ambient energy of the stone ground me. But psychometry is a two-way street. It doesn't just pull. It sometimes reflects. Standing there in the dark, the accumulated weight of the last 10 years crashed into my chest. People looked at me and saw a lazy, indifferent Omega who cared only for naps and luxury. They didn't see the reality. They didn't see the thousands of nights I had stayed awake until 4 in the morning, rewriting Richard's flawed architectural proposals because he lacked the spatial intelligence to design a functional staircase. They didn't see the years of me managing his emotional volatility, fixing his financial blunders, and erasing my own brilliance so his fragile alpha ego could shine. I wasn't born a salted fish. I was a genius architect and a top-tier analyst who had been systematically drained of life by a parasite in a designer. Zoot. My laziness was not a personality trait. It was a severe, structural burnout. It was a survival mechanism. My breathing hitched, a rare, unwelcome sting of tears pricked the corners of my eyes. I hated it. I hated feeling the residual exhaustion. Then, the air shifted. The scent of winter pine and ozone rolled over the balcony, thick and commanding, immediately neutralizing the anxiety in the air. I didn't open my eyes. I heard the quiet, deliberate footsteps approach. Alexander Thorne didn't speak. He didn't ask me what was wrong, or offer hollow platitudes, or demand that I explain my sudden vulnerability. He simply understood. I felt the heavy, comforting weight of something draping over my shoulders, then gently pulled up to cover my head entirely. It was his suit jacket. It was warm, lined with silk, and it smelled intensely of safety and absolute power. It created a perfect dark, sensory-deprived cocoon. I stood there, hidden beneath the ridiculously expensive charcoal wool, the world entirely blocked out. "Close your eyes, Silas," Alexander's voice rumbled, low and impossibly gentle, speaking right next to my ear. I reached up, gripping the lapels of his jacket, my knuckles white. "Just sleep," the most dangerous man in New York whispered into the dark. "I will clean up the rest." The fundamental flaw with high-stakes corporate sabotage is that it almost always occurs during my scheduled nap time. It was 2:15 on a Tuesday afternoon. I was deeply asleep on the absurdly comfortable velvet sofa in Alexander's penthouse, cocooned in an oversized, cream-colored cashmere sweater that technically belonged to him. Then, the elevator chimed, and Harrison Clark burst into the room. I didn't open my eyes. I just sighed, pulling the cashmere up over my nose. Harrison, unless the building is currently on fire, your presence here is a violation of my contract. Mr. Vance, Harrison gasped, sounding like he had just sprinted up 40 flights of stairs. It's an emergency board meeting. Arthur and Richard Sterling. They've bypassed the standard agenda. They're presenting doctored financial records right now, accusing the boss of embezzling from the European division to fund personal shell companies. I opened one eye, and Alexander is a billionaire apex predator. Let him eat them. They have a paper trail, Harrison insisted, adjusting his glasses frantically. It's brilliant. It's terrifying. They've linked the fake accounts to the very same discretionary funds Alexander opened for you. They're trying to frame him and use you as the motive. That made me open my other eye. I sat up, running a hand through my messy hair. They were trying to use my comfortable, fully funded retirement as a weapon. That was incredibly rude. Fine, I groaned, swinging my legs off the sofa. Get my shoes. Not the Oxfords, the loafers. I'm not tying laces for a hostile takeover. 10 minutes later, the heavy oak doors of the Thorne Industries executive boardroom on the 80th floor swung open. The room was a suffocating concentration of wealth power and aggressive alpha pheromones. 12 board members sat around a massive glass table. At the head of the table stood Arthur Thorne, looking uncharacteristically victorious. Next to him was Richard, pointing a laser at a complex financial flowchart projected on the wall. At the opposite end sat Alexander. He was leaning back in his chair, his expression completely unreadable, radiating a cold, dangerous stillness. The entire room froze as I walked in. I was a stark contrast to the sea of bespoke Italian suits. I was wearing Alexander's massive cashmere sweater, soft gray lounge pants, and zero makeup. I looked exactly like what I was, a man who had been dragged out of bed. Silas, Richard said, his voice dropping into that fake, patronizing tone I hated. This is a closed board meeting. You shouldn't be here. This is complicated financial business. I ignored him completely. I walked slowly down the length of the room, dragging my hand lazily along the edge of the glass table. I stopped right next to where Arthur had placed a sleek, silver USB drive, the source of the presentation. Is this the brilliant paper trail? I asked, looking down at the drive. Don't touch that, Arthur snapped. Those are highly confidential internal audits that prove my brother has been bleeding this company dry for. I placed my index finger flat against the cold metal of the USB drive. The psychometry hit me like a high-speed train. Metal holds memory best, and this tiny drive was practically screaming. I felt a rush of frantic, sweaty anxiety. I felt the late-night hours, the taste of cheap scotch, and the specific, greasy fear of getting caught. But more importantly, I felt the digital pathways. The numbers weren't just data. They were intentions. I felt where they came from, where they were altered, and exactly where they were being redirected. I pulled my finger back, a slow, lazy smile spread across my face. I picked up the USB drive and tossed it casually into the air, catching it in my palm. I looked at Richard. Richard, I said, my voice cutting through the heavy silence of the boardroom with crystal clarity. I was married to you for 10 years. I balanced your checkbooks. I fixed your structural blueprints. I know the exact capacity of your brain, and it is significantly lower than what this flowchart implies. Richard's face flushed. You have no idea what you're talking about. The metadata proves. The metadata is a poorly executed masking script. I interrupted, letting out a soft yawn. I leaned against the glass table, crossing my arms over the oversized sweater. If you're going to frame an Apex Alpha for embezzlement, Richard, you really shouldn't use the exact same Cayman Islands routing numbers you used to hide your marital assets during our divorce. A collective gasp echoed from the board members. Arthur paled instantly. That's a lie, Richard shouted, his alpha composure cracking. It's really not, I sighed, sounding immensely bored. You filtered $300 million through a shell company called Aegis Holdings. But you got lazy. You used the same secondary authorization code you've used since 2018. Your mother's maiden name and the year you won that architectural award I ghostwrote for you. I turned my gaze to Arthur, who looked like he was about to vomit. And Arthur, I continued, my tone conversational. Collaborating with my ex-husband, really. I can literally feel the desperation on this USB drive. You authorized the transfer of Thorn funds into Richard's dummy accounts to make it look like Alexander did it. But you logged in using the secure network at your Hamptons estate. I know this. Because the drive remembers the IP address. I dropped the USB drive onto the glass table. It clattered loudly in the dead silent room. Honestly, I muttered, rubbing my temples. This level of financial fraud is just embarrassing. A chatbot could write a more logical laundering scheme. If you're going to commit federal crimes, at least make it intellectually stimulating. I looked down the table at Alexander. He hadn't moved. He hadn't spoken a single word. But his slate gray eyes were fixed on me, burning with an intensity that was entirely unauthorized for a corporate setting. The predatory amusement was gone. In its place was absolute, possessive pride. Harrison, Alexander's voice finally rumbled, deep and terrifyingly calm. Harrison stepped out of the shadows by the door, holding a tablet. Yes, boss. Lock the doors. Call the federal authorities. Have them review the Hamptons IP address and the Aegis Holdings routing numbers Mr. Vance just graciously provided. Alexander stood up slowly, buttoning his suit jacket. He looked at Richard and Arthur, who were now completely paralyzed by the realization that their lives were effectively over, and freeze my brother's access to the building. The boardroom erupted into chaos, but I had already tuned it out. My job here was done. I turned around, navigating my way back to the heavy oak doors. I walked past Richard, who was staring at me as if he was seeing me for the very first time. He finally understood that the lazy, useless Omega he had discarded was actually the only thing that had been keeping him afloat for a decade. Silas, Richard whispered, his voice trembling. I didn't stop. I didn't even look at him. Don't speak to me, Richard, I yawned, pushing the doors open. You're cutting into my nap time. The fundamental problem with being kidnapped by your ex-husband is the sheer, embarrassing lack of imagination involved, also the dust. I was currently sitting in what appeared to be an abandoned meatpacking warehouse in deepest Brooklyn. I was tied to a wooden chair that was severely lacking in lumbar support, and the coarse nylon rope around my wrists was doing irreparable damage to the cuffs of my emerald green Tom Ford silk shirt. It was 6:30 in the evening. I was missing dinner. I was profoundly annoyed. A few feet in front of me, Richard Sterling was pacing furiously across the cracked concrete floor. He looked entirely unhinged. The bespoke suits and Wall Street arrogance were gone. He was wearing a wrinkled button-down shirt, sweating profusely, and muttering to himself. Behind him stood two massive, heavily tattooed men who looked like they had been rented by the hour. He took everything, Richard shouted, abruptly turning to point a trembling finger at me. Alexander Thorne took my company. He took my reputation. He froze my assets, and you helped him. I leaned back in the uncomfortable chair and sighed. Richard, please lower your voice, I said, my tone perfectly conversational. The acoustics in this room are terrible, and your whining is giving me a migraine. The two hired thugs exchanged a very confused look. Clearly, they were used to their victims crying, begging, or at least showing a basic level of distress. They were not accustomed to being reviewed like a disappointing customer service experience. You think this is a joke, Richard snarled, stepping closer. You think Thorne cares about you. Once I send him the ransom demand, he'll realize you're just a liability. Richard, I interrupted, shifting my wrist slightly. My skin brushed against the metal buckle of the thick rope. The psychometry flared instantly. I didn't feel the thugs' malice. I felt their overwhelming confusion and a distinct desire to get paid and leave. But more importantly, the ambient energy in the room, soaking into the damp concrete, was pure, pathetic desperation. Richard wasn't a mastermind. He was a cornered rat who had maxed out his last credit card to hire two goons in a completely illogical attempt to regain control. I am not a liability. I am an aggressively protected asset. I corrected him, feeling a yawn coming on. And honestly, if you were going to hold me for a multi-million-dollar ransom, you could have at least chosen a location with climate control. It smells like mildew and bad life choices in here. Richard's face contorted with rage. He raised his hand, stepping forward as if to strike me. He never got the chance. The temperature in the warehouse didn't just drop. It plummeted. The heavy, rusted metal doors at the far end of the building didn't open. They were violently ripped off their hinges, crashing onto the concrete with a deafening metallic scream. The two hired thugs instinctively took a step back, raising their weapons. Alexander Thorne walked into the dim light. He wasn't wearing his usual perfectly tailored suit. He was wearing a dark cashmere overcoat, open over a black shirt, and he looked like the literal wrath of a vengeful god. The alpha pheromones rolling off him were suffocating. Winter pine ozone. An absolute, pure murder. It was the kind of presence that forced the human nervous system into immediate submission. Behind him, I could see Harrison Clark, looking exceptionally pale, accompanied by a heavily armed private security team. The two thugs looked at Alexander, looked at his security team, mutually calculated their hourly rate, and immediately dropped their weapons, raising their hands in surrender. They were criminals, not idiots. Richard, however, was paralyzed. He stared at Alexander as if watching his own death approach. Alexander didn't look at the thugs. He didn't look at Richard. His slate gray eyes locked onto me, taking in the ropes, the chair, and the warehouse. The murderous intent in the room spiked so violently I could practically taste it in the air. He closed the distance in 3 long strides, grabbing Richard by the throat and lifting him entirely off his feet. Richard choked, his hands grasping frantically at Alexander's solid forearm. Alexander's expression was terrifyingly blank, his grip tightening as he prepared to effortlessly snap the neck of the man who had dared to touch his property. "Alexander," I called out. He didn't stop. The air crackled with lethal alpha aggression. "Alexander, stop," I said, a little louder, deliberately infusing my voice with a heavy, dramatic sigh. Alexander paused, turning his head slightly to look at me. His eyes were completely dark. "He touched you." "I know, and my dry cleaner is going to be furious about the rope burns on this silk," I complained, rolling my eyes. "But drop him, please." Alexander's jaw clenched. "Give me one reason why I shouldn't end him right now." "Because," I reasoned, leaning my head back against the chair, "if you murder a man in an abandoned warehouse, the amount of legal paperwork involved will be astronomical. Harrison will be filing police reports and covering up a homicide until 2030. He looks sleep-deprived enough as it is." By the door, Harrison adjusted his glasses and nodded frantically in agreement. "Furthermore," I continued, pouting slightly, "your private chef texted me 2 hours ago to say he was preparing the premium Wagyu beef for dinner. If we stay here to clean up a murder scene, the meat will get cold. And I categorically refuse to eat cold Wagyu because Richard is having a pathetic midlife crisis." For 3 long seconds, the warehouse was dead silent. The contrast between Alexander's lethal rage and my absolute domestic laziness hung heavy in the damp air. Then slowly, the terrifying tension in Alexander's shoulders eased. The darkness in his eyes receded, replaced by that familiar, helpless amusement. He let out a low breath that sounded remarkably like a laugh. He opened his hand. Richard collapsed onto the concrete floor, coughing violently, gasping for air as if he had just been pulled from the bottom of the ocean. Alexander stepped over him, ignoring him entirely. He knelt beside my chair, pulling a small silver knife from his coat. With 2 precise gentle cuts, the ropes fell away from my wrists. He took my hands in his thumbs gently rubbing the red marks on my skin. "Wagyu beef," Alexander murmured, his voice a low, rough rumble. "Medium rare," I confirmed, rubbing my wrists. "Now can we go? This place is a biohazard." On the floor, Richard finally caught his breath. He looked up, his eyes wide and bloodshot. He looked at Alexander kneeling before me, treating me like something infinitely precious. He finally realized that the power dynamic hadn't just shifted. It had never belonged to him in the first place. "Silas," Richard rasped, dragging himself up onto his knees. His voice was broken, dripping with a sudden, humiliating desperation. "Silas, please, I'm sorry. I was out of my mind, please. Just tell him to leave me alone. I have nothing left." Alexander tensed, but I placed a hand on his shoulder, stopping him. I looked down at Richard. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel triumph. I just felt an overwhelming, bone-deep exhaustion at the sight of him. "Richard," I said, my voice completely flat and devoid of any emotion, "your remorse cannot be exchanged for cash, and it certainly cannot be exchanged for my nap time, so please, get out of my sight before I let him kill you just to improve the view." I didn't wait for his response. I stood up, leaning into Alexander's side. He immediately wrapped a strong arm around my waist, pulling me close, shielding me entirely from the damp, the dirt, and the wreckage of my past. "Harrison," Alexander said over his shoulder as he guided me toward the door. "Call the police. Give them the building. Give them the idiot on the floor. I am taking my mate home for dinner." "Yes, boss," Harrison sighed, already pulling out his phone. I rested my head against Alexander's expensive cashmere coat as we walked out into the cool Brooklyn night. I really wasn't joking about the Wagyu, I mumbled, closing my eyes. Alexander pulled me tighter against him, pressing a warm kiss to the top of my head. I know Sila's. He whispered into the dark, I know. It took exactly 3 weeks for Richard Sterling's life to officially, legally, and spectacularly unravel. I didn't watch the news, because watching the news requires emotional investment, and I was fundamentally opposed to it. But I didn't need to. The results were wired directly to my bank account. Richard was currently facing federal charges for embezzlement fraud, and a remarkably creative string of tax evasions. His firm was liquidated. Preston, having realized the sinking ship had no lifeboats, had attempted to sell his story to a tabloid and was subsequently buried under a mountain of cease and desist letters. From Harrison Clark. The divorce was finalized in a quiet, heavily air-conditioned courtroom. I walked away with the Greenwich house, which I sold immediately, and a divorce settlement so large it made my accountant weep with joy. I was rich, I was free, and, most importantly, my 3-month fake mate contract with Alexander Thorne expired today at precisely 5 in the afternoon. It was 4:30. I was standing in the master bedroom of the penthouse, staring at a very small, remarkably empty suitcase. I had been trying to pack for 20 minutes, but I had hit a critical structural flaw in my plan. Folding clothes was an exhausting, tedious activity. I eventually decided to throw in one cashmere sweater, a toothbrush, and my passport. I was flying one way to Honolulu. I figured I could just buy new linen pants when I got there, or not wear pants at all. The island lifestyle was notoriously forgiving. I zipped the tiny suitcase shut, feeling a profound sense of accomplishment, and turned around. Alexander Thorne was leaning against the bedroom doorframe. I hadn't heard the elevator. I hadn't heard him walk in. But suddenly the room was entirely consumed by him. The dark bespoke suit, the suffocatingly heavy scent of winter pine and oath, and those slate-gray eyes locking onto my pathetic little suitcase. Going somewhere, Silas? Alexander asked. His voice was a low, resonant rumble that made the floorboards vibrate. Hawaii, I said, suppressing a yawn. My contract with you is fulfilled. Richard is destroyed. Arthur is currently working in a windowless basement office, and I have $50 million. I am going to find a beach, lie down, and actively decompose under the sun for the next 40 years. Alexander didn't move from the doorway. He just looked at me, his expression perfectly unreadable, radiating that cold, dangerous stillness that usually sent Wall Street executives into cardiac arrest. You can't go to Hawaii, he stated flatly. I raised an eyebrow. Is that a threat? Because if you're planning to kidnap me again, I must remind you that I require a minimum of 8 hours of sleep, and I categorically refuse to be tied to cheap furniture. Alexander's lips twitched. The terrifying Apex Alpha facade cracked, revealing that familiar, devastatingly fond amusement. He walked into the room, closing the distance between us until he was standing right in front of me, invading my personal space with the deliberate grace of a predator. He didn't pull out a velvet box. He didn't drop to one knee. He knew me entirely too well for that kind of exhausting cliché. Instead, he reached into his breast pocket and pulled out 2 items, placing them flat on the dresser next to my suitcase. The first was my yellow sticky note, the 3-star review. It was still perfectly laminated. The second was a thick, ivory-colored document, bound in leather. What is this? I asked, looking at the document. Harrison is going to have a stroke if you keep making me read things after business hours. It's a new contract, Alexander murmured, stepping closer, his hands coming to rest lightly on my waist. A permanent one. I narrowed my eyes and looked down at the paper. I didn't even need to use my psychometry. The terms were printed in bold, uncompromising ink. Clause 1. Alexander Thorne assumes all corporate financial and legal burdens for the duration of Silas Vance's natural life. Clause 2. Alexander Thorne is legally obligated to procure, prepare, and serve premium Wagyu beef, or any other culinary request, upon demand. Clause 3. Silas Vance is strictly prohibited from doing any actual work. Clause 4. Silas Vance is required to exist, nap frequently, and allow himself to be entirely, unconditionally adored. Clause 5. Silas Vance retains the right to insult Harrison Clark on Tuesdays. I read it twice. The sheer, audacious perfection of it settled over me like a heavy, warm blanket. I looked up at Alexander. His slate-gray eyes weren't cold anymore. They were entirely dark, burning with a possessive, overwhelming devotion that left no room for doubt. He wasn't trying to own me. He was offering himself to me, presenting his absolute power as a shield to protect my peace. Are these terms legally binding? I whispered, my heart doing a very very fast rhythm against my ribs. Harrison notarized it this morning while crying softly into his coffee. Alexander confirmed, his thumbs gently stroking my sides. Sign it, Silas. Stay with me. Let me give you the world, so you never have to lift a finger to build it yourself ever again. I stood there, feeling the warmth of his hands, the solid, immovable safety of his presence. I thought about the 10 years I had spent shrinking myself to fit into Richard's life. I thought about the exhaustion. And then I looked at the man in front of me, who had literally rewritten his entire corporate empire just to ensure my nap schedule remained uninterrupted. Do you have a pen? I sighed, leaning my forehead against his chest. Alexander let out a rough, shaky breath, wrapping his arms around me completely, burying his face in my hair. He pulled the sleek obsidian fountain pen from his pocket and pressed it into my hand. I signed the bottom of the page in a lazy scrawl. 6 months later, a blizzard shut down Manhattan. It was 2 o'clock in the afternoon on a Tuesday. I was lying on the velvet sofa in the penthouse, wrapped in Alexander's oversized cashmere sweater, watching the snow fall silently over Central Park. The acoustic dampening in the room was still perfect. The fire was crackling. In the open kitchen, the most terrifying, ruthless billionaire in North America was currently wearing a dark apron over his dress shirt, carefully flipping a perfectly marbled steak because I had casually mentioned I was hungry 20 minutes ago. My phone buzzed on the coffee table. A text from Dominic, my lawyer. Arthur is trying to sue for his office window back. Harrison is having a meltdown, call him. I looked at the phone. I looked at the snow. I looked at my ridiculously handsome, obscenely wealthy alpha husband who is currently plating my lunch. I turned my phone on Do Not Disturb and pulled the cashmere blanket up to my chin. The fundamental truth about life is this. People spend decades grinding, hustling, and breaking their own hearts in pursuit of success. But as I closed my eyes, letting the scent of winter pine and roasting Wagyu lull me to sleep, I realized they were all doing it wrong. Being a genius was exhausting, but marrying the right apex alpha, that was the ultimate, undisputed victory of a salted fish.